All right, I'm on the website I hate and you love, Dumb Dummies, and I'm going to endure humiliating tasks for payment. And today it seems like I'm going to ask screenwriters questions. Okay, let's get it over with. Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, and this is the Q&A. My agenda is simple. Each week, I plan to bring you in-depth insights into the creative process of storytelling. And folks, today I do humiliate myself by worshiping at the altar of Black Mirror and the genius who created it, Charlie Brooker, our guest. And wowza, season 7 is absolutely fantastic and is completely Emmy eligible. So I hope voters are paying attention to the fantastic writing at hand of this long-running Netflix series. The direction, the acting, the writing, especially, it's just all crackling. And yeah, it's a challenge to focus on an anthology show where there's new characters and storylines in every single episode for many hours at hand. And don't worry, I failed. It was impossible to talk about all the episodes, so we talked about a couple, and don't worry, it still turned into an engaging conversation because without a doubt, Charlie Brooker is very forthcoming about his creative process, so I know you'll dig this episode. And speaking of things to dig, I hope you check out Backstory Magazine. We turned 13 this year, and we couldn't have done it without you. Heck, it's my 20th year of podcasting, and I certainly couldn't have done it without you. So thanks for all that. And some really cool news is that we are just on the cusp of publishing issue 56, which is our Emmys Phase 1 issue, which has a ton of cool Emmys articles, including an article with Charlie Brooker on Black Mirror Season 7 that has different questions than this podcast because that was exactly the way that I wanted to engineer things. Folks, if you've never read Backstory, you could test drive us and read a free issue at backstory.net or via our iPad app, Backstory. And if you like what you see, and I hope that you do, I hope you consider becoming a subscriber, and you could use discount coupon code SAVE5 to save $5 off a one-year subscription. But look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and Apple Podcasts and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see all these Zoomcasts. That's right, you could see Charlie and I sitting around talking. It would really mean a lot to me to have you support independent film journalism, so thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our interview with creator, showrunner, and screenwriter Charlie Brooker about Black Mirror Season 7 on Netflix for your Emmy consideration in all the proper categories. It's good to see you. Huge fan of this show, and thanks for being here today, man. How you doing?
I'm doing all right, I'm okay. Yeah, I'm sitting in a hotel room talking to you. I've balanced my laptop on a tin of M&Ms that I took from the minibar.
Mine is on two different books, so it
Right.
works. It works.
I can't eat the M&Ms while I'm talking to you. I've said that they're there. They're just taunting me.
Well, all right, here we go. I just want to give people a baseline for you. So,
Mhm.
from whence dost thou hail? Where did you go to school? Did you study writing in school? Did you know that you wanted to be a TV writer?
So I grew up in a small little village in Oxfordshire, England, southern Oxfordshire, a village called Brightwell cum Sotwell. Cum is spelt C-U-M, actually, genuinely, where I grew up. So it was a, bucolic, idyllic sort of little place. I knew I was obsessed with TV comedy. My dad used to sort of force me to watch repeats of Monty Python.
Nice.
Kind of late at night. I was obsessed with shows like The Young Ones in the UK and Not the 9 O'Clock News and Fawlty Towers and all of that sort of stuff. So I loved Spitting Image. I loved sort of sketch comedy and stuff of that ilk when I was growing up. And that's what I kind of wanted to do. And I used to try and write sketches and sort of when I was a school kid and send them to places. Then I got into cartooning and I started drawing comic strips. And when I was like 15, I sent some comic strips to a kids comic in the UK. And our comics, we do have some sort of superhero type comic books and things like that. Predominantly, certainly at the time, they were more, I don't know what the analog would be, comedy sort of comics with one-page stories in them.
Heavy Metal Hurlon, like that. Mad
Kids.
Magazine.
Mad Magazine, kind of. There's a very specific type of British comic that's very hard to explain if you didn't grow up with it, actually.
Yeah.
There'd be one-off story, one-page story about, some kid with a magic thinking cap. We had our own Dennis the Menace. It's a weird coincidence if you Google that. There's two completely separate Dennis the Menaces. There's a British one who's a very different kid. But anyway, so I sent some comic strips into the letters page of this anarchic, slightly subversive kids comic that had been, and they wrote back and said, oh, will you come up with a comic strip for us? So that was my first writing job, was writing and drawing comic strips for this magazine. And also they had like parody, very mad magazine. They had parody articles, like fake quizzes or fake adverts for things. So that was my first sort of job when I was like a kid. And then I went and did media studies. I wanted to write sketches, but I didn't have on my radar the thought of writing, drama, TV drama didn't occur to me at all. I did sometimes see shows like The Twilight Zone late at night, and I liked them. And then I worked in a shop. I got a job. I spent my 20s sort of bitter that I wasn't writing TV comedy. Got a job writing video game reviews. I was doing comic strips. Then I started presenting a TV show about technology. I started doing a website, came up with a thing that was a bit Onion-esque, but about television. Got a job writing for the Guardian newspaper as a sort of TV critic. And then I got a job writing on the 11 o'clock show, which was a TV show, comedy show in Britain, which had Ricky Gervais and Sacha Baron Cohen on it, although I didn't actually get to work with them. And so I was sort of I started getting into some TV comedy writing. And that's what I wanted to do. And then I came up with a show called Dead Set, which was a zombie. It was a preposterous idea that we decided to play straight, the idea was there's a season of the TV show Big Brother, which was a huge deal at the time in the UK. Right. And the idea was there's a season of that and a zombie apocalypse breaks out and the 10 housemates inside are the only people in Britain who don't know that this has happened. I was a huge fan of like Italian sort of zombie movies of the 70s and the George Romero zombie films. This was before like The Walking Dead had been on TV, but it was after 28 Days Later. It showed that running zombies can be great. We got that commissioned, made it, and it went down well. And then Channel 4, who put it out in the UK, said to me, what else would you like to do? And I was like, well, I'd like to do a show that's a little bit like The Twilight Zone, but sort of darkly satirical. And I wasn't so much thinking of the tech aspect then. And it was going through the comedy department in the UK. And I should say by now, I was also presenting comedy shows, a little sort of topical comedy show in the UK. It sort of Black Mirror sprang from there, basically. Sorry, I'll give you a whole potted history, and then I went into the origin. I started lapping around the shores of the origins of Black Mirror.
That was
well.
perfect. I want to go back for a second because I discovered Twilight Zone as a kid as well, and it really inspired me. I mean, the concept of an anthology show operating on that level of satire, of politics, it was unlike anything I had ever seen. And Black Mirror really resonates in that category for me. So before we get too far deep, I've got to ask, what are some of your favorite episodes of Twilight Zone?
Of Twilight Zone? Okay, well, my favorite episode of The Twilight Zone, I've got quite a few. I remember early on seeing, is it Perchance to Dream, which is one where a guy goes in to tell his psychiatrist that he has a recurring dream that he died, and it turns the punchline is that he died. He walked in, sat down, and died, and none of what you just saw happened. Time Enough at Last with Burgess Meredith and the nuclear war. I was obsessed and terrified by nuclear war. When that was the other sort of major influence was Threads and things like that about sort of nuclear war. But that one again, the sort of the mercilessness of that ending, your stomach drops 10 floors down all of a sudden. The one where it's Bill Mooney playing a kid.
Yeah, absolutely. What I think
It's a Good Life.
Yeah, It's a Good Life, which I think influenced your Callister episode.
Oh, 100% it did. It's because it still completely holds up today.
Oh, yeah.
It's still a really deeply uncomfortable and disconcerting portrait of what it's like to tiptoe around a tyrant.
Just for our listeners that don't know, it's about a little kid that has magical powers that are pretty much limitless. And he basically is able to control the world, but he, gets angry as a little kid. It was remade in the Twilight Zone movie in the 80s.
Yes.
You took a stab at it with USS Callister in a different way, having like unlimited power in a virtual platform, in a video game.
Definitely.
And holding people hostage there because he holds a family hostage in the TV show and the movie. So it was a perfect inspiration.
You're 100% right, because I watched that episode and again, it was quite hard to find the Twilight Zone on TV in the UK. Yeah. It would be bounced around in the schedule and sometimes on different channels. It was often on really late at night. And I would read the synopses for episodes I hadn't seen. I got it on DVD when it sort of came out on DVD. You get and plow through episodes you hadn't seen. And I watched It's a Good Life I rewatched it probably around 2013, something like that, and was really struck by how, this is what it would be like in a dictatorship. They're in a dictatorship there. And so it was partly that it was definitely channeling that with USS Callister. It became and there's also slightly weird influences on it. And obviously Star Trek was a huge influence on that. I also liked with the Twilight Zone, it wouldn't necessarily explain to you, because it didn't have time to explain to you why things were happening. It didn't sort of say in that episode, with the It's a Good Life episode, it wasn't like it said to you, oh, one day the kid found a magic crystal and picked it up and was suddenly imbued with it. And no, it just is. That's just the world. That's what happens. Obviously there's some episodes that haven't aged so well and they can feel a little corny or a little pat, or it's all a bit neat. It's interesting how often they don't do that. Shadow Play, that's another really good one. Is it Shadow Play?
That's one of my all-time favorite episodes.
Yeah. There's a moment in that again, you sort of like, every so often they do a moment in the Twilight Zone, which in my head is the moment I'm looking for sometimes when I'm writing a Black Mirror. There's a moment in that when he says, that's the one. So that in that episode, there's a guy who is sentenced to death, right? He's sentenced to die on the electric chair. And he just kind of laughs when they announce that. And they say, what's so funny? And he says, this is a recurring dream I have. It happens every night. And when they throw the switch, this world will cease to
no,
exist.
and he slams the table and he says, not again.
Yeah.
And it's just the greatest opening ever. Sorry, I'm such a geek.
There's that moment where that's right. He's on death row, and the priest or whatever or somebody comes to speak to him, and he's explaining that this happens every night, but that the roles switch round. And he sort of says, well, yesterday, like that guy was the judge last time, and this, that, and the other. And there's a bit where there's somebody playing a harmonica or something like this, and he says, they're doing that because I have no idea what a real jail is like. But that's a cliche I've seen in films, is that the guy playing the harmonica in a cell, and that's why this is happening, because it's all coming from my imagination. It's so spooky and sort of self-aware and almost not quite fourth wall breaking, but so meta and creepy and on a level that you can't quite pin down, that I'm sometimes trying to channel that. Again, that's just now you could watch that. It must have come out, 65 years ago. And that's still as creepy.
I think that's an interesting thing to say, in which you're right, because it slightly breaks the fourth wall, reminding us that we're watching a television show, and he's referencing the cliches of TV and movies, which is something that Black Mirror does with our perception of technology in our everyday life while we're watching this stuff on TV, which is crazy.
I mean, somebody's pointed this out to me before, and it's not something I consciously am thinking about when sitting down to write an episode, that quite often with Black Mirror, the central question, or something that's a heartbeat that's beating away in the episode, is what's real and what's authentic. And that's often at the heart of actually all our stories, but I'm not consciously thinking about it. And often that would be in some of those Twilight Zone stories, that was the same thing.
I've always loved the episode Old Man in the Cave, because
is that the one where it's a computer?
Yeah, the computer's in the cave, but I remember watching it as a kid, and aside from it being a good apocalyptic episode, my last name's Goldsmith, so when Rod Serling comes into the frame and says, a certain Mr. Goldsmith, and I'm like, what? And I just remember standing up and yelling at night while everybody was asleep when I was a kid, like, my name's on the show. But I love it.
He's talking to me.
There have been attempts to recapture what the Twilight Zone was. I mean, the 80s version was good. William Friedkin's episode Nightcrawlers that he did. I don't think I've seen that. Oh God, it's amazing. And it's such a good episode. And people have done it over the years, but I gotta say the consistency of what you've created in Black Mirror is just on fire. I mean, for just genre storytelling. And it's fascinating that you're able to have episodes that vary so differently. In which sometimes, even this season, Eulogy is a two-hander, and it's a drama about longing. But USS Callister, to infinity, like, you're out in space again. You're doing special effects. You're doing
like a space opera. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a space opera. So you're right, because identity is key to your show.
In both of those stories, it's to do with what is or was real. In Eulogy, it's to do with like kind of the story he's told himself about what happened. And in Callister, it's more of a popcorn movie, like Callister. But it is, there's stuff about sort of digital identity and what makes you real, effectively. So it's a thing I'm constantly riffing on in the show. And again, I think that's when it works at its best. You're right. Eulogy was very much like one of the things in writing it. One of the things we were talking about was this could almost work as a stage play. Paul Giamatti said something interesting about it. He said, because he's a huge sci-fi nerd, Paul. So I had like a good chat with him about. He was like talking to me about Blake Seven, which is like a British sci-fi show of the 1970s. So he knows his onions. He's likened it slightly to some of the Twilight Zone episodes, which are a bit like, where they do ones where it's a bit like, it's a little bit Mad Men. I think Mad Men was influenced from, you'd get some sort of middle-aged guy would go and suddenly walk through just find himself in his hometown as a child or something
In
like
the
that.
simpler
Nostalgia
days,
sort of
yeah.
episodes. And when you're a young sort of angry teenager, that's like, oh, this one's boring. I don't like this one. This one's boring. I want one where, the nuclear bomb goes off or the aliens turn out to be, it's a cookbook, or that, and as you get older, you go, oh no, I appreciate that one more. And Eulogy slightly fits into that mold of, hopefully unsentimental sentiment, like in a
Well,
way.
absolutely. And we'll get into the details of Eulogy in the
Sure.
spoiler section. I want to talk about your
Mm.
writing habit for a second. And actually, if you could track it, if you're this self-aware, how it's evolved over your years of writing on Black Mirror, because this is your 7th season. How important is outlining to your process when you sit down to write?
Well, it really depends on the type of story. And again, if I jump back through history, so the first, like the national anthem, which is our very first one, one of the most divisive episodes we've ever done, which got received very differently in the UK, because I think, because people knew I come from a dark comedy background, and so people were more primed. They were confused because we deliberately advertised it like it was going to be a very straight political thriller, and that confused people more, I think, than the reveal in it. And actually, if you look at that episode, in my head, I was slightly, it's a parody of 24, the series with Kiefer Sutherland. And that's actually, I was actually actively thinking about the ad breaks, where the ad breaks would go, because it went out on Channel 4 in the UK, which is commercial, like, it was quite structured. It was like there's 10 minutes, then there's 10 minutes, then there's 10 minutes, then there's 10 minutes, and there's a cliffhanger every 10 minutes. And what I'm writing is, on one level, I'm writing a parody of a thriller, because what's happening is sort of ridiculous and gross and absurd. But on the other hand, we're going to play it straight, because that's going to, it will become genuinely disturbing, which it does. So that's sort of planned because it's quite plotty. Do you know what I mean? Like, then there's plot mechanics that have to happen. And so something like that, or an episode like Hated in the Nation, is plotty, and you have a lot of pieces on a chessboard that you're having to sort of move around. For the first 2 seasons, I didn't write outlines really at all. And I would sometimes kind of plow my way through.
Okay.
And then I ran into real trouble when we were doing, what was annoying was I snatched victory from the jaws of defeat, but like scared the shit out of everyone, because we were doing White Bear, and White Bear season 2, which is one of my favorites, really nasty one. And again, it's channeling the Wicker Man as well as like the Twilight Zone. And I should say Nigel Neal is another huge influence on this show, which I don't know if you're familiar with his work, and if you're not, you should look it up. But originally, White Bear, in that episode, for people who haven't seen it, there's like this woman wakes up, she's got no memory of who she is. There's a mysterious image on televisions, and she's told that this signal appeared, and a certain percentage of the population turned into these sort of voyeurs, dumb voyeurs who were filming everything on their phones, and then there were other people who were like mysteriously hunting them down and trying to kill them. That is then revealed in White Bear to be a fiction, and she's been told this whole lie, and there's a huge sort of twist. Originally, I'd written that story, and there wasn't the twist. It was that sort of, was this story about this mysterious signal, and it was a bit like, because I'd done Dead Set, this zombie show, it was a little bit like that. But it was a little bit sort of that. It was slightly confusing people. And we were on a recce to look at locations, because our base was we were on a former US Air Force base, was where we were, sort of our production base was. And we were looking around at like possible locations we could use. And one of them was a petrol station, a gas station. So, well, we've got this sort of abandoned gas station here. And I'm like, okay, we could use that. And they said, but the problem is we'll have to film this way because there's a big fence here, because it's on there's a big fence that surrounds this whole complex we're on. And I was like, big fence that surrounds the whole complex. Oh, hang on a minute. What if she's sort of in a theme park? Like, it was a whole new idea came in, and it was a much better idea. So in a Darwinian way, I went back home, basically ripped up the script, rewrote the whole thing in a sort of 48-hour fever dream. I think that's my record for writing a Black Mirror episode, because it was such a much better story, and everyone agreed it was a better story, but it scared the fuck out of everyone. So from that point on, I sort of wrote outlines so that we knew we were less flying blind. I'll often be walking around and I've got an idea for a story or a moment in the story or a hook or something in my head, and then I might have another idea for something else, and then something will join these two ideas together, and you go, oh, now I've got a Black Mirror episode. And I think what I was doing there was I had this idea in my head, which was it was based on something that had happened. I can track exactly where it came from. So when we were shooting Dead Set, there's a bit where Riz Ahmed, actually, because we've always been blessed with really good
Yeah,
casting, as Riz
absolutely.
Ahmed, there's a scene where he's running down the road pursued by some zombies. And we were filming this somewhere, and some members of the public showed up and started taking photos. I think it would have been photos at that time on their phones. And we're just sort of standing there, filming this guy who's being chased down the road and not intervening. And there was something about that image that I thought, oh my God, that's interesting. Like, what about, well, could I do a story that's like that? It's like a zombie. It's a bit like a zombie movie, but there's a percentage of the population who are just voyeurs, who are just watching this. That seemed creepy. I hadn't really thought through why that was happening.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Or I didn't quite know. It was just a creepy image. And I was trying to write a whole episode based on that one creepy image without some. And so you get to something. That was why I think the original story wasn't that satisfying. And then there's something about, and then you're looking around and there's something else occurs to you. You're sort of like, we're creating a fiction here for this show. I'm looking at this gas station that I know would be a good location for them to turn up in this story. But there's a wall there. There was just, I don't know, something fuses the two things together and you go, oh, right, I've got it. I've got it. And if she's a hated, what if she's an absolutely despised, why would somebody do that? Because if it's somebody who was a despised criminal. And then you've got a story that's about something completely different that I didn't see going into it, which is, that episode is asking, it asks questions about justice and, at what point does justice become revenge? And at what point does revenge become disproportionate? Are we just now in, what's the instinct that made people show up to public executions? Which is all sort of bleak stuff. And it wasn't what I was thinking of when I just wanted to do my cool zombie sort of idea. You find those themes in the writing, I think, it comes out while you're writing. And I don't have an answer to any of those questions either.
It gave you the layers that really made it a
Yeah.
memorable episode. So I mean,
Yeah.
that was perfect. My next question is really in your process. Do you prefer to write a certain amount of pages per day, or do you prefer to write for a certain amount of hours per day?
I am fucking awful. I've got better at, I'm more disciplined now. So what I used to do was I would sort of procrastinate, stare at the screen, pace up and down, be filled with self-loathing. And then I'd go sort of nocturnal when I had something to write. And I'd write overnight and then wake up at like noon or something. And now I've got kids. And so you can't kind of do that. I've now learned as well to factor in when I'm trying to work out roughly how long I think something's going to take. I factor in the time that I'm not doing it, but I'm angry with myself for not doing it, if that makes sense. I tend to write in bursts. Sometimes I'll turn a script around really quickly if I've got that sort of flow and what you're writing towards. If I can see what the last 10 seconds should look like, then I can write towards that and I can be really quick. I'll sometimes get stuck on the dumbest things, and it's usually pragmatic and weird things like, how did they find out that I need them to break into the library. So how do they find out where the library, and I'll sort of overthink something like that you can just have a character walks and goes, there's a library over there. It sort of doesn't matter.
Do you have a certain amount of time that you don't want to go over for a first draft? Like, all right, I'm getting a first draft in 3 weeks or whatever it is. Do you have a certain amount of time like that you apply?
No, I mean, again, practically I have to I'm getting better at the kind of like finger in the air. I think that one's going to take me roughly this amount of time. Like I say, I tend to be quite quick once I'm actually in there, and I can spend quite a bit of time working out it's weird. There's a sort of, I wish you could press a button and just sort of be in the zone. Do you know what I mean? Because it's when you get into that zone, I can spend whole days where I just sort of do sort of 5-minute bursts or 10-minute bursts. And then I'm like, and then after several days of that, you realize, actually now I've got, I've written 30 pages and then you sort of suddenly hit a streak sort of thing. So, and again, it depends on San Junipero was a really quick one to do. I turned it around really quickly. And then you get other ones that can take, that you just sort of get stuck on. There's another thing, it's a weird thing as a writer that sometimes you really get, and I see it in other writers, and I know I do it myself. It's interesting that as a writer, you're like Gollum, right? There's a bit of the story that's like my precious that you want is like, but this is the thing that makes me, this is my North Star. This is what I want to, it's about this. And this bit must happen because this is the thing that's making me want to write this. You're trying so hard to get that story element in that you're not paying attention to this, or you don't really need that. And it can sometimes, I'm trying to think, there was a really clear example of that now. I can't remember what it was, where there was something in particular that was my one thing I wanted to do. Oh, USS Callister. I can talk about that when we get to it. There was one thing I wanted to do.
Well, how about this? Let's get into the spoilers right now. So podcast listeners and Apple Podcasts and Spotify and YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see these Zoomcasts. You could see the amazing drapes behind Charlie in a hotel room. Press pause if you have not yet watched all of season 7. It's on Netflix right now. Black Mirror, it's waiting for you. We're going to get into talking about the details. And let's go right now into the spoiler. What were you going to tell us about Callister?
So as for the sequel, one of the things I really wanted to do was, we had this idea that in an earlier iteration of it, so Nanette and her crew are flying around in the game. Walton and co on the outside don't know where they are, but they know they're there, and it's a problem and they need to catch them and eradicate them. And so there was this idea, which I loved, which was, so what they do is they clone Nanette again and they send her in there, but they've edited her personality so she's evil. So they send an evil Nanette in to chase down heroic Nanette. Evil Nanette would look like a stereotype. She'd have an eye patch and a scar and look like a sort of space fascist. And she could lean into being an absolute Terminator / evil cackling villain sort of thing. And I loved the idea of that. And I was really holding on to that. And because originally it was going to be we were going to do it as a standalone series. Originally, we've been working on it for quite a long time, and then we couldn't. The pandemic happened, and then the writer's strike happened, and then no one's schedules were aligning. And we thought, you know what? We decided to boil the whole thing down into a feature length, and there just wasn't room to do that as well as everything else. Do you know
I love you were going to do an offshoot series of just Callister. Could that still happen, or did the movie take all the ideas that you were working with?
It took some of them. So we always knew, we kept calling it the Star Child version of Daily at the center of the universe. So we knew that as well. We knew that. So originally it was going to be, we worked out a whole sort of story, like a whole sort of 6-part story, which involved them all going on a quest. And there's all sorts of, again, a lot of the stuff, the real Nanette was always going to get hit by a car, and sort of it would end with her escaping, effectively. So all of those bits were there, present and correct, but there was a whole extra element that was to do with, originally it was to do with the company. There was going to be a merger, or the company was going to be being bought, and so somebody was in there, I don't even now remember the phrase, where they investigate the company to see if everything's legit, and they realize they've got this problem, that they've got these illegal clones running around in the game. And so it was sort of that. So you can see all the elements of that are still there, but in a more economical form now. There's, it was a really interesting process. And again, it was fun because you don't, on Black Mirror, obviously, you very rarely do you get to write for you will never really do you get to write for the same characters again. And they were such fun characters. I wanted to sort of carry on. So it was partly that. And that was the one that we always felt from the beginning. Toby Haynes, the director who directed the first one and the sequel, was like, we should do a sequel to this. It's setting it up. It feels like it's setting it up for a sequel at the end of the first one. So yeah, that was really good fun.
One question I've always had, are there any lost scripts? Are there any scripts that were just too crazy, too terrible, or too expensive, logistically impossible that you want to tell us about that were going to be on Black Mirror that have never been made and maybe either still could or are 100% abandoned?
There are, you see, that's the tricky thing, because there's a whole thing that I wrote that we haven't done. I was thinking about yesterday.
Nice.
That's about 6-7 years old now. So I was sort of thinking, do I dust that off, and could I revisit part of that? There have been a couple of sort of projects. There were a couple of things that never sort of got on the show, and then I kind of strip mined them for a key element, and that they became part. In Hotel Reverie, there was part of that was one Men Against Fire that we did in season 3, was kind of based partly on what was originally going to be the very first episode of Black Mirror ever, which was going to be a war parable.
Only because you brought it up. I have it circled on my list, and I want to get to the other ones. Men Against Fire, I think, has become one of the quintessential episodes for me. It's only because of where the world has gone.
Yeah.
It has a different meaning now. It's an episode that's technically about people, I'm just going to say, having their own bubbled reality that's been manipulated by a government or a military, or, you could also say possibly a corporation. You're not sure exactly who's pulling the strings. We are in that right now. There are
Yeah,
people
where
that
there's
I know.
competing realities.
Yeah, there
Yeah.
are people that I
Mm.
know that I cannot have a political or possibly even science conversation with because
Mhm.
I don't want to say that they're trapped, but they are trapped. They will not look outside of their zone. And I'm a curious
Mm.
guy. I ask people questions for a living, right? I
Yeah.
always like looking on the fringes and seeing what the other side is doing and the other side of everything, really. But in Men Against Fire, it is devastatingly dangerous to show the after effects of where that leads, which is
Mm.
genocide, military conflict, ethnic cleansing. Those are all covered in that episode. Do
Yeah.
you think
And
that we've been slipping in that direction? Do
I,
you look at it differently?
I do find it terrifying. I mean, that specifically, I was thinking about. I read a book, and I read a book about how actually in war people don't want to kill people. Like we don't actually want to pull the trigger. And they used to in World War One. They used to have the British Army used to have people whose job was to walk down the line, hitting people with a stick to make them fire their rifles, and that actually most people will fire over the heads of people and stuff like that, unless you go through a whole process. It was about how they learnt to overcome that instinct to not kill people, which is about dehumanizing the enemy and sort of teaching you, like calling them names, calling them coming out with the use of propaganda, de-othering. I do think at the moment we're in a scary place where you can choose a sort of form of reality you want to slip into, and then obstinately, propaganda has always been a thing. But I don't know. The other thing I find so odd is I find it weird because we're obviously going to face challenges with climate change. How do we survive if we cannot agree on what's real? I don't know, and that is terrifying. I just have to kind of hope that.
You answered that question that only if we join together with the Thronglets
There you go.
will we all be
Yeah,
copacetic and happy together. But that's a
there you
different
go.
episode. I want to get to
An
common people.
iOS upgrade for all of us, basically. That's what's
Exactly.
happening there. Yeah,
I
yeah.
want to get to common people for a second. You co-wrote
Mm.
it with Bisha KLE, and I'm curious, was
Mhm.
it kind of inspired by the great O. Henry story, The Gift of the Magi, which is a husband and wife,
Mhm.
sacrificing everything to give each other a gift for their undying love for each other, but they've gone too far. This is like a perverted version of it in which a subscription service is keeping his wife alive, and
Right.
they have to get secondary jobs and all of their money goes to keeping her alive, and then she starts even losing who she is, in which
Yeah.
ads start coming out of her mouth as part of the subscription model that they're on, which is crazy. So what inspired that? And I love the episode.
Well, oh, thank you. I've not read that. I'm so badly read. It's like, but
You've heard of it. The husband's getting her a comb and she sold her hair to a wig maker. So that's
I must have
I'm
heard of
sure you've
that.
heard of it. That's the dark
Right.
ending. That's the big reveal of the 1906 O. Henry story.
Gotcha. Blimey, that is bleak, isn't it?
He sold everything to get her a comb, and she sold everything
and then
to get
she
something.
sold her hair.
She sold her hair, and she got him a watch band, and he sold her
Right.
his watch. Blah blah blah.
The inspiration for that, it was two things. One, I'd had this idea about, what if you have to have part of your brain cut out, but it's okay because there's a streaming backup of it. But it's a bit like cell service and you have to stay within range of masts and so I was thinking about that. And then I was struck by listening to podcasts, how sometimes the host has to break into a sales pitch. I was listening to a true crime one, and like the host was sort of describing at 9 a.m. the police found the horribly mutilated body of the gardener down by the canal. Have you heard of HelloFresh, the food delivery service? It certainly changed my attitude towards keeping fit and nutrition. And I thought, God, that's so weird.
Ooh, hey, I'm jumping in really quick because I had forgotten to do an ad, and Charlie just reminded me to do it. And no, I'm not evil. I won't do a full ad here after Charlie teed it up so perfectly in talking about how an ad inspired common people. But all I'm saying is if you've never read Backstory, you could test drive us on our site and in our iPad app. We hope you do check out Backstory magazine because there is a Charlie Brooker article in our Emmys Phase 1 issue, which is coming out any day now. And it is filled with questions that are not in this podcast. And we engineered it that way so that we and our subscribers could double dip with all the Charlie Brooker knowledge. So no. I'm just informing you, I'm not really doing an ad. That's why I'm going to cut right back into our interview for the last few minutes here with good old creator, showrunner, and screenwriter Charlie Brooker as he continues to discuss Black Mirror Season 7, which you could watch on Netflix and is Emmy eligible in all the proper categories.
originally with that episode, I thought this is going to be a light comedy. This is going to be a comedy. It's a comedy one. It's a comic premise about a woman starts spouting adverts and all the comic ramifications of that. And then the more we discussed it, I realized I was thinking about enshittification, if you've heard that word. It's like Cory Doctorow, the writer Cory Doctorow is calling this term for the way that sort of services degrade over time because they need to expand, but they mean squeezing the user. It's a brilliant take. It's like, and you see it everywhere. I can't remember if was it during, while we were making it or just before that, I've got one of those Amazon Echo Show things in our kitchen, which is a nice, it's a useful sort of egg timer effectively and sort of in-house intercom and photo frame, show you photos of things, just started showing adverts and you can't switch it off. You can't stop it. And then so it expanded from the adverts through to kind of everything, enshittification, the sense of everything being squeezed and everyone being squeezed. And so there's a sort of clammy desperation to that episode. But it starts out looking like it's a kind of indie movie comedy and then it gets darker and darker and darker.
I think it's brilliant. It's about sacrifice. But, even talking about what works so much about the show, and I still want to get to the other episodes, but I think your key, your secret sauce is that you're really talented with character writing. If you,
thank you.
And with a combination of emotional writing in there, but if you just only stuck to the plot of this cool idea of someone's brain having to be a subscription service, the Dumb Dummies website where the husband is humiliating himself to keep his wife alive, a reveal that he unfortunately has to go through after questioning, why is somebody pulling their teeth out? Why is somebody doing this terrible thing online? He's that guy by the end. It's interesting. What could you tell us about meshing the two together of cool narrative ideas, which is what drives Black Mirror for people to talk about at the water cooler, but it's the engagement with characters and their own specific points of view done all over the place in your anthology. It's not like you have a through line except when you do a sequel like Callister.
Again, depending on the tone of the episode, with something like that, it was very important that they were a loving couple. Like early on, it was like, well, we're going to do a story where, they're just the nicest couple. There's like a really sweet, hardworking couple. They're so in love with each other that makes it so much worse. Do you know what I mean? Like they're so much in love with each other and not in a sickening way, but you had to sort of like them. I guess once I've worked out what the dilemma is at the heart of the episode, you're just, I don't know, it's difficult. You're just trying to channel how you would feel. The analogy I sometimes use is like, you've got your map of the story, and then it's like Google Maps, and then you've got the little, the little Street View guy, the little orange guy you can drop onto and then he's in the street looking around, and you try to do that bit. So once you've got your map, you've built your maze, and then you drop yourself into the brain of the rat you've put in them sometimes, and then you try and have them behave truthfully. That's as much as I can sort of articulate the process, I guess, of doing that. Sometimes I'd hear writers sort of say, oh, I was writing something and the character didn't want to do that. Or I was writing something and the character suddenly revealed this about themselves. And I used to think, you liar, come on, that's nonsense. What are you talking about? And when I was writing San Junipero, I'd written an outline for San Junipero, but the ending of the episode originally was, oh, look, they're old ladies. That was the end, like that Kelly walks into real Kelly in the real world as an old lady, walks in and sees real old Yorkie, the end. And when I was writing the script, I thought, I'm going to keep going. So I had Kelly propose, and then there's a scene where she reveals her whole backstory and that her daughter, she lost her daughter and then she lost her husband, and that was news to me, and it was because I guess I'd done that little Street View thing. So that's as close as I can come to articulating it. Sometimes you do that and then you're kind of not physically there while you're writing. It's really weird, but again, that's the state you try to get to, and so if we pull it off, hooray.
I mean, the ending was
Common People is so...
Yeah. I mean, like, because you're taking this funny idea, you're going darker with it, and then finally the sacrifice of letting someone die with dignity. I mean, at the end of the day, this was all to get more time with her back on the clock, her living, rather than her dying from that brain tumor. It was insane that, like, as he's choking her out with a pillow...
She's advertising.
She's doing an ad.
She's advertising, like, antidepressant gummies. I remember when coming up with that idea. The awful thing is, I'm really laughing. I was like really laughing when I was like, oh, and then, oh my God, imagine that. Like, she'll be like, the perfect time to kill her is, well, there's a cold logic to it as well, because we show you throughout the episode that when she does the sales pitches, she's not aware. So she's sort of not present. So when she says just before that, do it while I'm not here, it was also important that you understood that she wants this to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, they've agreed that this sort of euthanasia. So she says, do it when I'm not there. And she means smother me when I'm mid-set. So that's why he does it. But again, it's such a darkly comic idea. It doesn't get bleaker and blacker in terms of comedy than that. Originally, in the room, I'm giggling in a sort of like, that would be so horrible. And then you play it out and it's fucking harrowing, but sort of still jet black comedy in there too. Yeah, that was when I delivered that script, the producer for that one, Richard Webb, was like, Jesus Christ, this is distilled essence of Black Mirror.
I mean, it really is. It's a perfect episode. Charlie, I'm really just in awe of what you've been able to do with Black Mirror. I hope it keeps going forever. Please transfer your brain to AI so that it can keep going forever. Whatever you need
I'll do my best.
Yeah, do your best. Do your best. And thank you for coming down and having a chat today.
Thank you. A pleasure.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to creator, showrunner, and screenwriter Charlie Brooker for being so generous with his time in coming down to chat about Black Mirror Season 7, which you could watch on Netflix and is Emmy eligible in all the proper categories. And while you're surfing around online, I hope you also check out Backstory Magazine. It is our 13th year of publishing, and we are actually publishing our Emmys Phase 1 issue this week, which includes an article with Charlie Brooker that has different questions than this podcast. So we double dipped, and our subscribers can double dip with us. If you've never read Backstory Magazine, you could test drive us by reading us on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. And if you like what you see, and I hope that you do, you could use discount coupon code SAVE5 to save $5 off a 1-year subscription. But look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and Apple Podcasts and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see all these Zoomcasts. That's right, you could see Charlie and I having a chat. It would really mean a lot to me to have you join us and support independent film journalism and consider becoming a subscriber. So thanks for considering. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2025. All rights reserved. And folks, if you want to get in touch with us, we're on social media. You could find me on Blue Sky as Yo Goldsmith and also Backstory_mag. You could also find me on Twitter as Yo Goldsmith and Backstory_mag. And you could find me on Instagram as Yo Goldsmith and Backstory_mag. Do you see a trend here? If you want to go old school and email me, you could write into backstoryletters@gmail.com. I even have a Facebook fan page, so there's a lot of ways to get a hold of me, and I'll do my darndest to respond. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A, thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.